Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal. I'm the host of Living History. In the last few programs, we have been talking about the Middle East, which all historians say it was the cradle of civilization. This is a part 3 of a 4-part series in relation to the Middle East. The Middle East is currently one of the most important and yet most troubled regions of the world. Apart from its importance as the main provider of energy supplies that keep the whole world going, it is a region that is responsible for so much instability and destruction through military conflicts. It is a region of the world that could decide the future of humanity, for it is said to be the setting for Armageddon, a prophecy on which Jews, Christians and Muslims agree, a battle that will bring about great destruction. Ironically, the Middle East was also the setting for the rise of civilization, a region that is accepted by almost all historians as the cradle of civilization. It is the region of the world that is central to the teachings of the 3 Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. A region that produced more prophets and reformers than any other part of the world. As I said, we've explored in this series. In the first part of this series, we looked at the earliest human settlements and the rise of the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, current-day Iraq. In part 2, we looked at the great prophets and kings and great empires of the Middle East, from the Akkadian Empire to the Assyrian, Babylonian and Egyptian empires, which had so much impact on human history. These empires have fascinated us from their interactions with great prophets that led to our current religions, and from the wonders they left behind as discovered by our archaeologists and other scientists. So in this program, in part 3 of the series, we are going to explore in much more detail the great Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian empires, and their tremendous contributions to the march of civilization. We will also look at their interactions with an important group of Semitic people, the Israelites, who miraculously have survived till this day, whilst all the other empires and religions of the Middle East have been blown under the sands of time. To help me discuss these important programs, I'm joined once again by Arif, Ahmad and Amjad Hussain, our history experts. Assalamu alaikum to both of you.
Wa alaikum salam, Doctor.
Wa alaikum salam.
I hope the listeners have enjoyed the first 2 parts we've done. So let's start with Amjad on this part 3, looking at the rise of Assyrian power. Just tell us a little bit about the name Assyrian, where it arose, and a little bit about the empire, Amjad.
The Assyrian Empire, Dr. Muhammad Iqbal Sahib, is considered the greatest of the Mesopotamian empires due to its expense and the development of its bureaucracy and military strategies which allowed it to grow and flourish. The Assyrians were basically Semitic people who originally spoke and wrote Akkadian before the easier to use Aramaic language became more popular. For instance, according to the book of Genesis, the city of Ashur, located on the Tigris-Euphrates river systems in the upper Mesopotamia, was founded by a man named Ashur, son of Shem, who was the son of Noah after the Great Flood, who then went on to found the other important Assyrian cities. The history of Assyrian civilization of Mesopotamia between 2500 BCE to 2025 BCE is termed as the early period. It is the first of the 4 periods into which the history of the Assyrian civilization is traditionally divided. The other periods are the Old Assyrian Empire from 2025 BCE to 1378 BCE. The Middle Assyrian Empire is from 1392 BCE to 934 BCE, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is basically falls between 911 BCE to 609.
In fact, it's interesting, Amjad, at its peak, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is the last of the major Assyrian empires, ruled over what the ancient Mesopotamian religion referred to as the 4 corners of the world. That was the world at that stage, and that's how they defined it. As far north as the Caucasus Mountains within the lands of what is today called Armenia and Azerbaijan, as far east as the Zagros Mountains within the territory of present-day Iran, and as far south as the Arabian Desert of today's Saudi Arabia, as far west as the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea, and even further to west in Egypt and eastern Syria. However, it started off as a small entity, Arif, and let's just look at the early period of Assyria, which Amjad noted was the 2500 BCE period. Just take us through that early period of Assyrians.
Yes, of course. So in the early part of that period, that's between approximately 2500 BC and 2400 BC, the Assyrian kings were basically pastoral leaders, and they didn't refer to themselves as king in their inscriptions. Usually they call themselves a vicegerent. That's a word that can mean governor, and they were a vicegerent of the god Ashur. So Erishum, the vicegerent of the god Ashur, son of Ilushma, vicegerent of the god Ashur, built the entire temple area of the temple of the god Ashur. This is part of an inscription which is found on the Assyrian temple stairway, and this is how we know how they refer to themselves. Moving on about 100 years, so around 2400 BC, the Assyrians became subject to the Sargon of Akkad.
Yeah, we covered Sargon in the last program, part 2, if listeners want to listen in more detail, but carry on, please.
So absolutely. So if we move on to then the old Assyrian Empire, which, as Amjad said, is between 2025 BC and 1378 BC. Again, in the earlier part of that, that's 2100 BC to 1800 BC, Assyria became a regionally powerful nation. The most successful leader of this period was Shamshi-Adad I, and he was around in 1809 BC to 1776 BC. He was an Amorite ruler. He was a great organizer, and he kept firm control over all matters of state, from high policy down to the appointing of officials and the dispatching of provisions. With the annexation of Mari, Shamshad had carved out a large empire encompassing much of Syria, Anatolia, and the whole of Upper Mesopotamia. This empire is often referred to as either the Kingdom of Mesopotamia or the Upper Mesopotamian Empire. Shamshad, he proclaimed himself as king of all. And again, this is a title that had been used by Sargon of the Akkadian Empire. After his death, the empire started to decline as other regional powers asserted their authority. So around 1800 BC, Assyria came into conflict with the newly created city-state of Babylon, which eventually eclipsed the far older Sumero-Akkadian states and cities in the south, and they were incorporated into Greater Babylonia. After securing its core borders on all sides, Assyria entered into a quiet and peaceful period in history, which lasted for about 2.5 centuries.
It's interesting, isn't it? The Assyrians and the Babylonians were always vying for power after the Sumerians and Akkadians had sort of declined a little bit. So Amjad, take us through then the rise of Babylonian power. Although early on they were still a secondary power compared to the Assyrians, but they started rising and they had their glory. Just take us through the rise of Babylonian power.
Well, basically, Dr. Mohammed Iqbal said Babylon is derived from Bab Ili or Bab-Il, which means the gate of God, was the capital, and the earliest mention of the city can be found in a clay tablet from the reign of Sargon of Akkad, dating back to the 3rd century BCE. Babylon was merely a religious and cultural center at this point, and neither an independent state nor a large city. It was often involved in rivalry with other older states of Assyria to the north and Elam to the east in ancient Iran. Like Assyria, the Babylonian state retained written Akkadian language, the language of its native populace, for official use, despite its northwest Semitic-speaking Aramite founders and Kissite successors who spoke a language isolate, not being a native Mesopotamians. The Babylonian Empire was the most powerful state in the ancient world after the fall of Assyrian Empire that happened around 612 BCE.
You can take us through to the first Babylonian dynasty, because that had one of the greatest Amorite rulers. So just take us through that period as well.
Absolutely.
This was the Amorite dynasty.
The Amorite dynasty, Dr. Iqbal said. Yeah. Babylon remained a minor town in a small state until the reign of the sixth Aramite ruler, Hammurabi, which dates to 1792 to 1750 BC. He conducted major building works in Babylon, expanding it from a small town into a great city worthy of kingship. A very efficient ruler he was. He established bureaucracy, for instance, with taxation and centralized form of government. Hammurabi freed Babylonia from Elamite dominance and indeed drove the Elamites from the southern Mesopotamia entirely. He then systematically conquered southern Mesopotamia, including the city of Isin, Lhasa, Kish, Laksha, Nippo, Uruk. Just to mention
these
a few,
were some of the big cities really of that,
one
the
of the major
known
cities,
world of that stage.
And of course the major city of the Elam, which was Eridu. His conquest gave the region stability after turbulent times, he basically coalesced all these patchwork of small states into a single nation. It is only from the time of Hammurabi the southern Mesopotamia acquired the name Babylonia.
Yeah, Hammurabi turned his disciplined armies eastwards and invaded the region which 1,000 years later became Iran, conquering Elam, Gutians, and Kassites. To the west, he conquered the Amorite states of the Levant, modern Syria and Jordan, including the powerful kingdoms of Mari and Yamad. Arif, just tell us a little bit more about his interaction with the old Assyrian Empire as well.
Well, after all of these conquests, he entered into a protracted war with the old Assyrian Empire for the control of Mesopotamia and the dominance of the Near East. Assyria had extended control over much of the Hurrian and Haitian parts of southeast Anatolia from the 21st century BC and from the latter part of the 20th century BC, had asserted itself over the northeast Levant and central Mesopotamia. After this protracted struggle over decades, with the powerful Assyrian kings Shamshi Adad I and Ishmi Dagan I, Hammurabi forced their successor Mut Ashkur to pay tribute to Babylon in around 1751 BC, thus giving Babylonia control over Assyria's centuries-old Haitian and Hurrian colonies in Anatolia. Babylonia briefly became the major power in the region after Hammurabi created a short-lived empire succeeding the earlier Akkadian Empire, Third Dynasty of Ur, and the old Assyrian Empire.
Hammurabi is very famous for the Code of Hammurabi. Amjad, do you want to tell us, because that's a very important historical code that even to this day amazes historians. Just take us through that important bit.
Absolutely. That's what he's well known for, and of course it's on a clear tablet and still preserved, although it is presented as a practical collection of laws, including the principles of punishment with eye for an eye. The document also served to promote the achievements during his reign. The 282 case laws included economic provisions, prices, tariffs, trade and commerce, family law, that's marriage and divorce, as well as criminal law, that includes assault and theft, and so on, and civil laws as well, dealing with slavery and debt and so forth. Penalties varied according to the status of the offenders and the circumstances of the offenders. The prologue to his code, the article of just law, speaks of allowing the king's will, law and order to prevail in his kingdom. The code was inscribed on a diorite stele or a column over 6.5 feet tall. The original has survived and is kept in the Louvre in Paris, France. The effects of these laws long outlived Hammurabi's empire itself. The copies of the code were frequently made, and the Assyrians and the Persians were influenced by it. And in fact, the code of Hammurabi continues to influence even to this day. And I know there is one copy of it in the American Supreme Court, along with Prophet Mohammed as a great lawgiver. After his death, however, the Babylonian Empire rapidly fell apart, unfortunately, as his sons could not defend the empire from the technologically advanced Assyrians and the new power that established itself in central Anatolia, the Hittites. The Hittites were basically Indo-European people who had crossed the Caucasus Mountains, possibly from southern Russia, and entered Asia Minor during the first centuries of the second millennium BC. By 1340 BC, however, they had become one of the dominant powers of the Middle East. The Hittites were repeatedly mentioned throughout the Old Testament as the adversaries of the Israelites and their God. According to Genesis 10, for instance, they were the descendants of Heth, son of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, born of Noah, which is basically mentioned in Genesis 10, 1-6. So basically around 1596 BCE, the Hittites, led by one of their leaders, sacked Babylon, carrying off the treasures of the city temple and scattering its population.
In fact, the Hittites did a major dismantling job of the Babylonians and Assyrians quite often, and were major challenges to the Egyptians, which we will cover in part 4 as well. The Amorite rule came to end for a variety of reasons, and then the Babylonians had the Kassite dynasty from 1595 to 1155 BC. The destruction of Babylon by the Hittites, of course, opened the way for this. The Kassites renamed Babylon as Kadunias. The Kassites, like the Amorite rulers who had preceded them, were not originally native to Mesopotamia. Rather, they had first appeared in the Zagros Mountains of what is today northwestern Iran. Babylonia experienced short periods of relative power, but in general proved to be relatively weak under the long rule of the Kassites, although they spent long periods under Assyrian and Elamite domination and interference, but overall they ruled for quite a long time, as was clear. Arif, let's turn to the Middle Assyrian period. So Babylonia had declined, even though the Kassites were ruling, but they were not major players in shaping things. It was, again, back to the Assyrians. So just take us through the Middle Assyrian Empire, which is 1392
to 934 BC. So the Assyrians, during the Old Assyrian Empire, period, they continued to have struggles with their neighbors, especially in the Mitanni, but overall they kept their empire intact. And during this Middle Assyrian period, Assyria became a great power once again in the region. When Ashur-ubalati I, who was around between 1365 to 1330 BC, succeeded the throne of Assyria in 1365, he proved to be a fierce and ambitious and powerful ruler. Assyrian pressure from the southeast and Hittite pressure from the northwest enabled him to break the Mitanni power.
The Mitanni at that stage were quite a big power around that time. So carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. So he met and decisively defeated Shutana II, who was the Mitanni king, in battle. And this once again made Assyria an imperial power at the expense of not only the Mitanni, but also Kassite Babylonia, the Hurrians and the Hittites. And the lands of Mitanni and the Hurrians were duly appropriated by Assyria, making it into a large and powerful empire.
In 1274 BC, Shalimsar the first, that's 1274 to 1244, ascended the throne. And here you start seeing some references in the Old Testament as well to the various Assyrian kings as well. But he proved to be a great warrior king, expanded the empire significantly. The Hittites, having failed to save Mitanni, allied with Babylon in an unsuccessful economic war against Assyria for many years. As Assyria was now a large and powerful empire and a major threat to Egyptian and Hittite interests in the region, these two leading powers made a pact not to fight with each other. So again, take us through this next growth and expansion period of Assyrian power, Amjad, please?
The Assyrian power basically grew to a great extent in the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I, who was the son of Shalmaneser I. He decisively defeated the Hittites at the Battle of Nearia and then conquered Babylon, taking the ruler of Babylon as captive. Now that he himself was the ruler of Babylon, he also took on the old titles of the kings of Sumer and Akkad. These were first used by Sargon of Akkad. So basically, Tukulti-Ninurta I thus became the first Akkadian-speaking native Mesopotamian ruler to rule the state of Babylonia. His founders, having been foreign Amorites, succeeded by equally foreign Kissites. So first time there was a now kind of indigenous ruler, so to speak. After a few influential leaders taking the throne, Assyria's throne was taken by a certain guy called Tiglath Pileser I. And during his 38-year reign, he was seen as one of the greatest Assyrian conquerors.
Yeah, I think he's regarded probably as the one setting the scene for the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which grew to its greatest extent. But these kings were really big players in getting Assyrian power established. But all the powers in that region at that stage were using bronze as the major metal of military conflicts. And historians say that there came a stage that's known as the Bronze Age collapse, when all the major empires using bronze started collapsing due to a variety of reasons, attacks from other nomads. And from sort of 1200 BC to 900 BC was known as the Dark Age for the entire Near East, North Africa, Asia Minor, Caucasus and Mediterranean, including the Balkan regions as well. Interestingly, Assyria and its empire were not unduly affected by these tumultuous events. 450 years, perhaps the only ancient power that was still pretty stable and doing okay, but of course their use of iron, as we will see later on, totally transformed things. But Arif, just take us through this tumultuous period and also their linkage with the Israelites, because that was an important group of people. They were minor players, but just take us through this
Absolutely.
period.
So as you mentioned, this was a very tumultuous period. And a rather significant event was taking place under the noses of the major regional powers. In the land of Canaan, which was often a vassal state of either the Egyptians or the Hittites or the Assyrians, there was a highly determined group of Semitic people who were beginning to take deep root. These people were the direct descendants of the prophet Abraham, and they had left the city of Ur in Mesopotamia and migrated to Canaan. The Israelites had finally returned to and made a claim to the promised land of Abraham after a period of captivity in Egypt. I'm sure many of our
we're going to cover that in part 4 as well, because that's a very interesting period, but go on.
Yes, so I think, as I said, most of our listeners will know a little bit about this, but after their exodus from Egypt, under the leadership of Moses, the Jewish people had spent over 40 years trying to reach the promised land, which Moses was not able to see for himself in his lifetime. It was actual General Joshua and the Israelites who defeated the Canaanites and took all of their land. Scholars have dated the invasion of the Israelites to around about 1250 BCE, and archaeological excavations in the region have confirmed that there was some kind of disturbance in the region between 1250 and 1150 BC, which resulted in the destruction of the Canaanite towns and cities. By 1080 BCE, the kingdom of Israel had been established with Saul as leader. He ruled between 1080 and 1010 BC as king, and Saul was followed by King David and his son Solomon. Following Solomon's death, the kingdom split into two, with Israel as a northern state and Judea in the south.
This period brings an interesting really learning for us from what we know from the Bible, the Old Testament, of what happened to the Hebrews, the Israelites, etc., and what archaeology is telling us about some of these great empires and how powerful they were and how they interacted with the Israelites. Despite the apparent weakness of Assyria during the Bronze Age collapse, in comparison to its former might, at heart Assyria, in fact, remained a solid, well-defended nation whose warriors were the best in the world. Assyria, with its stable monarchy, powerful army and secure borders, was in a stronger position during this time than potential rivals such as Egypt, Babylonia, Elam and Phrygia, etc. This is probably a good time to break for the first part, and then we will come back to part 2 to pick up really the Babylonian power and Assyrian power as well. You've been listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program. We hope you've enjoyed listening to part 1 of this program. It's a 4-part series, as I said at the start. This is part 3, and in part 4 we will be covering the Egyptian empire as well. Please do go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under programs you will see all the Living History programs on SoundCloud, and you can listen to those. Feedback would be greatly welcome. You can contact us on Twitter as well. Our hashtag is @VI Living History. And please do send us messages however you can, and if you have any specific interests or specific programs you want us to do that as well. Join you back shortly. Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to the second part of this program. So this is part 3 of our Middle East series. As I said at the start, this is a 4-part series on the Middle East. In part 1, we had covered Sumerian civilization from early settlements. In part 2, we had covered some of the great prophets and great kings and early empires as well. And this is part 3, where we're covering the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian empires in a lot more detail. In part 1 of this program, the first half an hour or so, we covered the rise of Assyrian and Babylonian power and some of the early established empires. But of course it was during the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires when they reached their zenith, their greatest power. So in this second part we're going to cover that period and also their interaction in particular with the Hebrews and the Israelites as well, because a lot of what we have learnt in history is through what the Old Testament tells us, as well as our archaeological records and findings that we found. So let's start off. I'm going to go to Amjad first, but talk about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which was around 911 BCE to 609 BCE. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was in existence around this period, and it became the largest empire of the world up till that time. The Assyrians were the first to be armed with iron weapons, and this was really a transformation in terms of military success in campaigns. And so after the collapse of the Bronze Age Empire, iron became available, and the Assyrians had the advantage of having it first. And their troops employed it very effectively with appropriate military tactics as well. The Assyrians perfected early techniques of imperial rule, many of which became standard in latter empires, and was, according to many historians, the first real empire in history. Although, as we said earlier, the Akkadian Empire was recorded as the first empire, but this was amongst the big empires in history. At its greatest extent, the Neo-Assyrian Empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, and from southern Egypt to Lake Van in Anatolia. Now that was a big empire of that time. Amjad, just take us through the Neo-Assyrian Empire build-up.
Basically, the Assyrians themselves did not refer to this phase of their history or their empire as Neo-Assyrians, but regarded it simply as another development in their history. Neo-Assyrian is a modern designation coined by historians and based on an interpretation of ancient inscriptions that suggest a change in the way the empire was now ruled. During the Neo-Assyrian period, the kings of Assyria increased their kingdom size to its largest extent, as you properly mentioned, Dr. Saib. In addition to retaking Babylonia and part of modern-day Lebanon, the Assyrians launched a series of campaigns into modern-day Israel and Palestine, earning them enormous mentions in the Hebrew Bible, for instance. The kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire built on a lavish scale. They ruled from their capital city at Ashur, Nimrod, Khorasabad, and Nineveh. When a king decided to move his capital or to simply rebuild it, they made sure it was bigger and better was what was to come before.
I mean, that was the hallmark, to be honest, and I know listeners won't be able to sort of see much, but when you see in the museums and in the books some of their, capital and the buildings, they really were breathtaking. The reign of King Adad Nirari II, that was circa around 912 to 891 BCE, brought the kind of revival Assyria needed at the time. The Assyrians had lost territory, prestige and power following both the Bronze Age collapse and invasions by the Arameans and Amorites and the Sea Peoples. Adad Nirari II reconquered the lands that had been lost and secured the borders. The defeated Arameans were executed or deported to regions within the heartland of Assyria and assimilated into the culture. That was a common thing that the Assyrians did. Arif, just take us through this period and following Adad's rule.
So the kings who followed Adad Nirari, they continued in the same vein, and they continued the same policies and military expansion. So Tukultu Nitura II, who reigned between 891 to 884 BC, he expanded the empire to the north, and he gained further territory toward the south in Anatolia. The next king, Ashurnasirpal II, between 884 and 859 BC, he consolidated rule in Levant and then extended Assyrian rule through Canaan. He also moved the capital from Ashur to his newly built city of Kalu, which is also known as Nimrud, which he adorned with over 41 types of trees that he carried back from his campaigns. This builds on what Amjad Sahib had mentioned about, the cities were obviously very grand and had, influences from all parts of the kingdom. So Nimrud or Kalu was built through slave labor, and these were also brought back from these campaigns, which had been successful in subjugating a significant amount of territory. In battle, he had employed the Assyrians' most common method of conquest, which was siege warfare, which would begin with a brutal assault on the city, on a particular city. And just to give you some idea of what tactics were used, if we read just what the historian Simon Anglim has written, he said that more than anything else, the Assyrian army excelled at siege warfare and was probably the first force to carry a separate corps of engineers. Assault was their principal tactic against the heavily fortified cities of the Near East. They developed a great variety of methods for breaching enemy walls. Sappers were employed to undermine walls or to light fires underneath wooden gates, and ramps were thrown up to allow men to go over the ramparts or to attempt a breach on the upper section of a wall where it was the least thick. Mobile ladders allowed attackers to cross moats and quickly assault any point in the defences. These operations were covered by masses of archers who were the core of the infantry. But the pride of the Assyrian siege train were their engines. These were multi-storied wooden towers with 4 wheels and a turret on top, and 1 or at times 2 battering rams at the base. So I hope that gives our listeners just some idea of how sophisticated and how organized their military tactics were.
One of the biggest names amongst the rulers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was Tiglath-Pileser III. Amjad, do you want to take us through his period, because he really consolidated a lot of the territory, and the subjugation under him was quite...
Basically, the empire was revitalized under his leadership. He was basically around from 745 to 727 BCE, and according to some scholars, the Neo-Assyrian Empire actually began with Tiglath-Pileser III. Such was his impact, basically, that under his reign, the Assyrian army became the most effective military force in history up until that time, and would provide a model for all future armies in organization, tactics, training, and efficiency. Apart from reorganizing the military, he restructured the bureaucracy of the government, allowing, basically according to historian Simon Angam, like my colleague suggested, Tilgat Shah III, for instance, he carried out, and I quote from this historian's book, carried out extensive reforms of the army, reassured central control over the empire, reconquered the Mediterranean seaboards, and even subjugated Babylon. He replaced conscription, in the military service with manpower, which was basically levy imposed on each province, and also demanded contingents from the vassal states. He also defeated the kingdom of Urartu, which had again given rise to trouble the Assyrian rulers, and subjugated the region of Syria. Tilgat Shah III was basically followed by Shalmansar V, and Shalmansar V, he was around from 727 to 722 BCE, who continued the king's policy but was not as effective in military campaign. His successor, however, Sargon II, who was around from 722 to 705 BCE, was a brilliant military leader himself, administrator as well, who expanded the empire further than any other king before.
Both Assyrian inscriptions and the Hebrew Bible say that the Assyrians under King Sargon II, whose reign was around 722 to 705, as Amjad mentioned, completely destroyed Israel. Sargon II said in an inscription that he conquered and sacked all the towns and cities in Israel and led away as booty 27,290 inhabitants. A lot of this is covered in detail in the Old Testament. Sargon II, of course, founded the Sargonoid dynasty. Just Arif, just take us through this period and really quite the sad treatment of the Hebrews who lost so much.
Absolutely. So Sargon II was followed by his son, Sennacherib, who was around from 705 to 681 BC, and he turned his attention to Judea, conquering its cities and towns and laying siege to Jerusalem itself.
Because just for listeners, so after the return of the Jews to Canaan, they succeeded under General Joshua to take the land. But after the reign of Solomon and many others, the kingdom fell apart into the northern part, Israel, and southern part, Judah. So Judah was the southern part, but carry on, Arif.
Absolutely. I think we mentioned that in the first part of the program.
Yeah, we did, yeah.
So while accounts from both the Hebrew Bible and Assyrian inscriptions say that the siege took place, it's not entirely clear exactly how the battle ended. However, Sennacherib's military victories increased the wealth of the empire beyond what Sargon II had accomplished, even though his reign was marred by persistent military campaigns against Babylon and the Elamites. Once again, he was another one that moved the capital, so he moved from Sargon city of Durashurkurin, which is modern Khorsabad, to Nineveh. And during his reign, Nineveh was transformed into a metropolis whose size and splendor would astonish the ancient world. Just to give you some idea, it covered 7 square kilometers, and its palaces and temples were adorned with colossal sculptures and brilliantly carved reliefs. An intricate system of canals and aqueducts watered the king's pleasure gardens and game parks, and his grand residence, which was known as the Palace Without Rival, was built to be an object of wonder for all the people.
I mean, these are something listeners really have to see in the books and the museums to grasp, really.
It's very difficult to obviously convey how these look through the radio, but visitors entered the palace through massive gateways flanked by colossal human-headed winged bulls, known as lamusu, that protected the king from dangerous supernatural forces. So he beautified and improved the city's original structure, planting orchids and gardens. And again, if we look at what some of the historians have said, the historian Christopher Scare writes, Sennacherib's palace had all the usual accoutrements of a major Assyrian residence. Colossal guardian figures and impressively carved stone reliefs. There was over 2,000 sculptured slabs in 71 rooms. Its gardens too were exceptional. Recent research by the British Assyriologist Stephanie Daly has suggested that these were the famous hanging gardens of Babylon, which I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard of, and these were known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Later writers placed the hanging gardens at Babylon, but extensive research has failed to find any trace of them. Sennacherib's proud account of the palace gardens he created at Nineveh fits that of the hanging gardens in several significant details, so it could be that he was the one that was behind the hanging gardens of Babylon.
So Babylon, of course, meanwhile, behind the scenes, had been a persistent problem throughout Sennacherib's reign. However, he finally grew tired of dealing with it, ignoring the lessons of the past and not content with his great wealth and luxury of the city. Sennacherib drove his army against Babylon, sacked it, and looted the temples. As earlier in history with Tukulti Ninurta I in 1244 to 1208 BC, the looting and destruction of the temples of Babylon was seen as the height of sacrilege by the people of the region, and also by Sennacherib's sons, who assassinated him in his palace in Nineveh in order to placate the wrath of the gods. Whatever else, Babylon still had a certain significance to people of that culture. Amjad, just take us through who his successor was, and I think his elder sons really were the ones who played the role in the assassination, but his younger son took over. Just take us through that period.
Well, basically, Dr. Saab, you're absolutely right, because the elder sons had blood on their hands, and I think those who were behind the throne, and according to the wishes of Sennacherib's wishes were that his youngest son, Issar Haddon, who was around from 681 to 699 BC, he took the throne after defeating his brother's factions in a 6-week civil war. With his rule now secured, one of his first projects was to rebuild Babylon. After defeating the Saktians, the Cimmerians and the Medes, he then turned his attention westwards to the Phoenicians, who had been allying themselves with the Nubian, the Kushite rulers of Egypt against him. He sacked Sidon in 667 BC, and he also captured King Manasseh of Judea, keeping him prisoner for some time in Babylon.
Yeah, this is well covered, isn't it, in the Bible, in Chronicles 33, verse 11, so this particular aspect. But carry on, sorry, go on.
Yeah, having had enough of Egyptian meddling, Isra Haddon raided Egypt in 673 BC. After 2 years later, he launched a full invasion and conquered Egypt, chasing the pharaoh back to Nubia, thus bringing an end to Nubian Kushite rule in Egypt and destroying the Kush Empire, which had begun in 760 BC. The Babylonian chronicles retell how Egypt was sacked and its gods were abducted. The Bible graphically recounts Egypt's demise in Isaiah 20 verse 4, for instance, and it reads, "So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian prisoners and the Ethiopian captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. And they shall be afraid, ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectations, and Egypt their glory."
This we're going to cover next in our next program, part 4 of the Middle East series. Egypt was a very proud nation and civilization, and to have this done to them was quite something. But it showed the power of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at that stage. The empire, of course, flourished under his reign. Shadon established the empire's borders as far north as the Zagros Mountains, modern-day Iran, and as far south as Nubia, modern-day Sudan, with a span including the Levant, modern-day Lebanon, to Israel, and through Anatolia, which is sort of modern-day Turkey. So you can see the expanse. It was a big empire by all accounts. His successful military campaigns and careful maintenance of the government provided the stability for advances in medicine, literacy, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and the arts. Another historian, Durant, writes, and this is his quote, "In the field of art, Assyria equaled her preceptor Babylonia, and in bas relief, that is sculpture, surpassed her. Stimulated by the influx of wealth into Ashur, Kalak and Nineveh, artists and artisans began to produce for nobles and their ladies, for kings and palaces, for priests and temples, jewels of every description, cast metal, as skillfully designed and finely wrought as on the great gates of Balawat, and luxurious furniture of richly carved and costly woods, strengthened with metal and inlaid with gold, silver, bronze, or precious stones. So it creates this image of some amazing craftsmanship and power and glory of that empire. So Arif, take us through this sort of final stages of this empire from the Sarashidan onwards in terms of securing peace and stability of the empire.
Yes, absolutely. So in order to secure the peace, Esarhaddon entered into vassal treaties with the Persians and the Medes, requiring them to submit in advance to his successor. Also his mother, Zakutu, who was around between 701 to 668 BCE, issued a decree which was known as the Loyalty Treaty of Nakia Zakutu that compelled the Assyrian court and the subject territories to accept Ashurbanipal as king and support his reign. This ensured the easy transition of power when Esarhaddon died, preparing to campaign against the Nubians, and the rule passed to his son, who was the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, who reigned between 668 and 627 BCE. He was the most literate of the Assyrian rulers and is probably best known in the modern day for the vast library he collected at his palace in Nineveh. Although he was a great patron of the arts and the culture, he could be just as ruthless as his predecessors in securing the empire and intimidating his enemies. So, for example, he decisively defeated the Elamites, completed his father's conquest of Egypt, and expanded the empire further to the east and to the north. Recognizing the importance of preserving the past, he also sent envoys to every point in the lands under his control and had them retrieve or copy the books of that city or town, bringing all of them back to Nineveh for the royal library. While not the first king to collect books, he was the first to make such a collection a priority.
So Assyria under Ashurbanipal now appeared stronger than ever. After the crushing of the Babylonian revolt, Ashurbanipal appeared master of all he surveyed. To the east, Elam was devastated and prostrate before Assyria, and the Manians and the Iranian Persians and Medes were vassals. To the south, Babylonia was occupied. The Chaldeans, Arabs, Sutu, and Nabatians subjugated. The Nubian Empire destroyed, and Egypt paid tribute. To the north, the Scythians and the Cimmerians had been vanquished and driven from Assyrian territory. Urartu, Phrygia, Kodun, and the Neo-Hittites were in vassalage, and Lydia pleaded for Assyrian protection. To the west, Aramea, which is Syria, the Phoenicians, Israel, Judah, Samaria, and Cyprus were subjugated, and the Hellenized inhabitants of Caria, Cilicia, and
Cappadocia
paid tribute to Assyria. So you could see the impact and influence. But of course, all empires decline in due time and come to an end. So Amjad, take us through then the period of decline and fall of Assyria.
Basically, Ashurbanipal ruled over the empire for 42 years, and in that time campaigned successfully and ruled efficiently. The empire had grown too large. However, the regions were overtaxed. Further, the vastness of the Assyrian domain made it difficult to defend the borders. As great in numbers as the army remained, there were not enough men to keep garrisoned at every significant fort or outpost. Following the death of Ashurbanipal around 631 BC, it just took under 20 years for the empire to crumble. The Babylonians, under their leader Nabopolassar, rebelled against the Assyrian rule, causing chaos throughout the land. Assyria was doomed when the Medes from western Iran, led by Cyaxares, joined the assault by sacking the holy city of Ashur. Nabopolassar and Cyaxares swore an alliance that was to seal the Assyrians' fate. For instance, in 612 BCE, the two armies converged on Nineveh. The greatest city in existence fell. Its palaces and temples burned to the ground, and the last Assyrian king to reign from Nineveh, Sin-shar-ishuk, perished in the flames. The fall of Assyria was an iconic event that was recorded in the passage of the Bible and the Greek and Roman writers. Accounts describe how Assyria was punished for the moral depravity of his rulers, who surrounded themselves with great riches and luxury. The negative image of Assyria in Bible and Greco-Roman literature was challenged by archaeological discoveries of the mid-19th century, which established Assyria as one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. The region of Assyrians, much like that of the Babylonians, emphasized worship of nature. They believed every object of nature was possessed by a spirit. The chief god was Ashur. All of the primary gods whom they worshipped were related to the object of nature. These included Anu, god of the heavens; Baal, god of the region inhabited by man, beast, and the birds; Ea, god of the water; Sin, the moon god; Shamash, the sun god; and Ramman, god of the storms. These gods were followed by 5 gods of the planets. In addition to these primary gods, lesser gods were also worshipped. In some cases, various cities had their own patron gods. The pagan worship of the Assyrian was vehemently condemned by several prophets in the Old Testament. For instance, Ezekiel in 10:15, and also in Hosea 8:9.
These are obviously beliefs that were challenged by the monotheistic faith of the Hebrews and the Israelites throughout, who still remained a minor power compared to these great empires. And we saw how the great Neo-Assyrian Empire came to an end, largely through the planning of Babylonians. Arif, if we just could cover quickly this Neo-Babylonian phase. I think we know how the allies were gathered together by Nabopolassar in 620 from the Babylonian side,
yes.
And how they came to defeat. But just take us through that.
Yes, so in 620, Nabopolassar, previously an unknown chieftain of the Chaldeans, who had settled in southeastern Mesopotamia around 850 BC, seized control over much of Babylonia. He entered the Babylonians and Chaldeans into an alliance with a number of regional players, in particular Cyaxares, king of Iran. And this powerful alliance managed to defeat the Assyrian king, and Nineveh was sacked and taken. However, pockets of Assyrian resistance remained, and after quashing this in 605 BC, the seat of empire was thus transferred to Babylonia for the first time since Hammurabi over 1,000 years before.
Nabopolassar was followed by his son Nebuchadnezzar II, and this is a name familiar, I think, to most biblical historians and those who follow the Bible closely. His reign was from 605 to 562, a reign of 43 years, and he made Babylon once more the ruler of much of the civilized world, taking over portions of the former Assyrian Empire. Basically, he's recalled for taking the Israelites in bondage as well. Amjad, do you want to just quickly go through Nebuchadnezzar's, because I think we're coming towards the end of the program. So
Nebuchadnezzar II basically campaigned against the Egyptians and drove them back over the Sinai. However, an attempt to take Egypt itself, as his Assyrian predecessors had succeeded in doing, failed, mainly due to a series of rebellions from the Israelites of the Judea and the former kingdom of Ephraim.
Which is one of the reasons why we took such a harsh measure against the Israelites, because they sided with the Egyptians. So he took them in bondage, and the rest we know quite a lot. But go on, carry on.
Yes, although also the Phoenicians and the Canaanites and the Armenians of the Levant also gave him much of the trouble. The Babylonian king crushed these rebellions, however, deposed Joachim, the king of Judea, and deported a sizable part of the population to Babylonia. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Damascus were also subjugated. The Arabs and other southern Arabian people who had dwelt in the desert to the south of the borders of Mesopotamia were then also subjugated. In 657 BC, he went to war with Pharaoh Amasis and briefly invaded Egypt itself. After securing his empire, which included marrying a Median princess, he devoted himself to maintaining the empire and conducting numerous impressive building projects in Babylon. He is credited with building the fabled Hanging Gardens of Babylonia.
I think that probably brings us to a stage where even the Neo-Babylonian Empire was swept aside, probably one of the greatest emperors of all time, and that was Cyrus the Great, who in 539 basically became one of the greatest emperors that the world has seen. But that's for another program, for another time. I think we've had a fascinating look at the impact of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Overall, probably the Assyrians had the biggest impact, although the Babylonians are talked of a lot as well. And if it wasn't for the Assyrians, we probably wouldn't know much about antiquity, so we should thank them and the Babylonians and others for saving us so much of antiquity. But we learn from history. That's what history teaches us, and that's what God Almighty also teaches us as well. Learn from the past. We hope that listeners have enjoyed this program. So we got one more to go, and that's the Egyptian civilization and their interaction with the Hebrews and Israelites, and the children of Abraham as well, which is an important thing. So please do go on to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk. Listen to this program in due course and others as well. I think there's over 30 plus programs now on history. A variety of subjects are covered there. And our Twitter hashtag is @VILivingHistory. So please do give us your feedback. Until then, Assalamu alaikum.